What a treat! The Virginia Woolf is about to deliver a lecture at our college. The title of her lecture is A Room of One's Own, which is odd because it was supposed to be about women and fiction. But this strange title captures the gestalt of Woolf's historic essay. A gestalt is something like a text or even a whole body of work that is somehow greater than the sum of its individual parts. A room of one's own is a famous battle cry for aspiring writers, especially female ones. Its profound yet practical message has echoed down the ages. If you want to be a writer, you need a steady income and a lockable room of your own. Woolf is going to tell us the story of how she came to this conclusion, which means she'll treat us with all her gifts as a novelist. Throughout the story, we'll meet a few Marys, most of whom are author surrogates, or fictional characters based on the author. Woolf will refer to herself and other characters as Mary, but she'll also refer to herself in the first person, using I, me, or my. To avoid confusion, we'll refer to Woolf as the narrator, which is the person who tells us the story. In the days leading up to this lecture, our narrator visits a very old and prestigious university in England. There she is, sitting on the riverbank, deep in thought about women and fiction. When she leaves her spot to wander the grounds, that's when the trouble starts. First, she's accosted by a beadle who orders her off the grass and back onto the gravel path. This causes her to lose her train of thought. Then, she's barred entry to the library because she's an unaccompanied female. Now this makes the narrator angry. To quell her rage, she marvels at the chapel's stunning architecture. This beautiful university is the result of centuries of hard work and vast amounts of gold, all so that generations of Englishmen could advance themselves and the empire. Lucky them. The narrator's spirits are lifted at lunch, which is a sumptuous affair. What an amazing effect a good meal has on one's mood and intellect. However, the sight of a Manx cat on the lawn outside kills the buzz. Its missing tail reminds her of how the Great War has altered society. For one, there's less joy and music in people's voices. As she walks down the road to Fernham, the women's college, the narrator ponders this phenomenon. The war may have killed romance, but truth has risen in its place. Dinner at Fernham sure is basic compared to the lunch at the main campus. It goes to show how poor women are compared to men. But why are women so poor? And how can we expect anyone to think and work well if they haven't dined well? After dinner, the narrator catches up with her friend Mary Seaton, a science teacher at Fernham. The conversation soon turns to women's poverty and how England's social and legal structures have held women back. As for the college, it's a miracle they found the money to build it at all. As she walks back to her hotel, the narrator stews on this troubling cultural legacy. It's such a shame that women have been excluded from the wealth and traditions enjoyed by men. How might this affect the minds of female writers? Back home in London, the narrator heads to the British Museum to do some research. She wants to know, once and for all, why women are so poor. As she makes her way through a huge pile of books about women, she notices that they're all written by men. And all these male experts have wildly differing opinions about women, some of which are highly offensive. In the end, the narrator can't find a conclusive answer to the question of women's poverty. Disappointed and humiliated, she sketches an angry-looking professor instead. He represents all the experts whose degrading opinions about women fill entire libraries. What a waste of a morning. At lunch, the narrator flips through the newspaper and thinks about the patriarchy in England. It's clear that men are the dominant gender in this country, and they've relied on women to help them keep it that way. But what if women stopped enabling this perverse addiction to power? Perhaps someone sitting in Woolf's audience can tackle that question. For now, the narrator must pay her lunch bill. Oh, the joy of financial independence! Thanks to the generosity of her aunt, the late Mary Beaton, the narrator has a yearly income to live on. Once bitter and enslaved to low-paying jobs, the narrator is now free to be creative. It also means she doesn't have to depend on a man. As she walks home, the narrator tries to imagine the future. What will it be like for women in the 2020s? Surely they will live freely, have any job they want, and be truly valued in what they do. Has this come true? A short time later, the narrator sits in her private study, pondering history. She realises that she needs facts about the history of women's poverty, not dodgy opinions. So she consults her own library, starting with books on the Elizabethan period. Now that was a grim time for women. They were controlled by their families or husbands, mostly illiterate, confined to the home, and often abused. No wonder Shakespeare doesn't have a female counterpart that we know of, but what if he had a sister? The narrator imagines that William Shakespeare had an equally gifted sister named Judith. She dreams of joining the theatre like her brother, but her gender and circumstances prevent her. With no outlet for her creative genius, Judith goes mad, kills herself, and is forgotten by history. It's a depressing thought experiment, but a realistic one. Most of the women who did manage to write in the 1600s were, of course, rich and childless. They were also sneered at for their efforts and became very bitter as a result. But then we have Aphra Behn, a middle-class woman who had some success in the 1600s. She managed to make a living from writing, which was a milestone. Her pioneering efforts gave women's writing a sense of dignity. So, by the middle of the 1700s, middle-class women had begun to write. Thus, a literary tradition for women was finally established. This paved the way for icons like Jane Austen, the Bronte sisters, and George Eliot, whose work is still widely enjoyed today. Thanks to all these women, Virginia Woolf can encourage her audience to go out and make a living by writing. As the narrator peruses her shelves, she's impressed by the number of novels, all written by women in the 1800s. Few of these women would have had rooms of their own. No doubt they were also constantly interrupted, which is probably why they wrote novels. The chapter format allowed them to discreetly write a little every day and still fulfill their domestic duties. Jane Austen seems to have coped extremely well under the circumstances. In fact, the narrator thinks her work is incandescent, like Shakespeare's. Meanwhile, Charlotte Bronte has hints of bitterness in her work. Her red-hot anger over the position of women in society snuck into the narration in Jane Eyre. Of course, women in the 1800s were still pressured to maintain their respectability, and finding public fame through writing as a woman was frowned upon. Hence their preference for male pseudonyms and secrecy. This leads the narrator to consider what makes a novel stand the test of time. Integrity is the thing, that magical element of truth that resonates across time and space. When female novelists get distracted by patriarchal nonsense, it tends to damage the integrity of their work. Then again, it's hard to ignore the loud, sexist opinions of all those angry experts. But Jane Austen and Emily Bronte did. That's why they're awesome. Here, Woolf appeals to her audience. Women's literature needs a stronger tradition. Do what you can to build it up. Women must write authentically, be courageously original, and honour their literary mothers who paved the way. There are ways for women to express their creative genius that haven't even been invented yet, so get to work. Back in the story, the narrator selects a new novel from her shelf, Life's Adventure by Mary Carmichael. She wants to know whether Mary has done justice to her literary mothers. She's no Jane Austen, that's for sure, but as she reads on, the narrator notices something extraordinary. The two female characters, Chloe and Olivia, like each other. At this point, Woolf tells her audience not to blush. These things do happen, but it might be a literary first, especially in the nuanced way Carmichael depicts her characters. It's art for art's sake, detached from considerations of class, gender, and morality. What an achievement! Mary Carmichael might not be a genius, but she's mastered the first lesson of writing fiction: be unconscious of your own sex. Perhaps in another 100 years, with an income and a room of her own, Mary will write something even better. The next day, the narrator takes in the view from her window. She watches a man and woman get into a taxi together and appreciates the harmony of the scene. It symbolises or represents the kind of genderless mental harmony writers should try to cultivate within themselves. If they can do this, they have a shot at being incandescent, like Shakespeare was. To test her theory, the narrator reads through a few books written by men. Mr. A's novel and Mr. B's poetry both seem to have the same problem: the self-centred dryness of unrelenting masculinity. She hopes this is just a passing phase in men's literature of the early 1900s. Perhaps it's in response to the recent women's movement. The narrator concludes that androgyny of the mind is crucial to a writer's integrity. In other words, to write something of lasting quality, a writer must allow the gendered parts of their mind to fuse and cooperate. A non-binary brain. Now there's a thought. Here, Woolf sets the narrative aside to address us directly. She anticipates that people will criticise her for placing too much importance on material things. But as the great Sir Arthur Quiller Couch explained, great writing depends on intellectual freedom, and intellectual freedom depends on material things. It's very hard to be creative if you're poor and constantly stressed about food, clothing, and shelter. That's been the reality of women in England for too long. Unfortunately, a steady income and a private room are still rare luxuries. But thanks to the women who've gone before us, it's becoming more achievable. So those who do have their material needs sorted must write all kinds of books. The patriarchy is still alive and well, and women have their work cut out for them. Honour your literary mothers and keep working and writing, even if it's a struggle. Woolf believes it will all be worth it in the end, because the wild, poetic spirit of Judith Shakespeare will live again through our daughters. Did Virginia Woolf's dream come true? Are women finally free to write, say, and do what they like in the 21st century? We hope you enjoyed this schooling online production. For more easy lessons, check out our other videos.